People like him don't belong here." The words rang out across the gun shop with enough volume to turn every head in the room. The Saturday crowd fell quiet for a moment, their conversations dissolving into a low murmur as they watched the scene unfold near the display counter. The speaker was Tyler Brooks, 28 years old, broad-shouldered, confident, and wearing the black polo shirt that identified him as the store's lead sales associate. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, staring at the elderly man in front of him as if he were dealing with a nuisance rather than a customer. The old man said nothing. Walter Hayes simply stood there beside the glass case that held a row of vintage rifles. At 83 years old, he looked exactly like the kind of person most shoppers would overlook without a second thought. His gray hair was thin. His shoulders carried the weight of time. A weathered wooden cane rested lightly in one hand. His faded tan jacket had seen decades of use, and the worn leather satchel hanging from his shoulder looked older than many of the customers browsing the aisles. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing about him demanded attention. Yet there was something unusual about the calm way he stood amid the growing hostility. He neither argued nor defended himself. He simply watched Tyler with pale blue eyes that remained steady despite the tension building around them. The store manager emerged from a nearby office after hearing raised voices. His expression tightened the moment he saw the crowd gathering. "What's going on?" he asked. Tyler pointed toward Walter. "He's been handling merchandise without permission. Says he just wants to look. Won't tell us what he's actually here for." Several customers exchanged uncertain glances. That wasn't entirely true. Walter had spoken only once since entering the shop nearly 20 minutes earlier. He had quietly asked if they still carried parts for an old Marine Corps rifle. The question had earned little more than a smirk. The manager stepped closer and looked Walter up and down. His eyes lingered on the old satchel. "Sir," he said in a tone that sounded polite only on the surface, "I think it's time for you to leave." Silence settled over the room. Somewhere near the ammunition shelves, a customer lowered his phone and stopped scrolling. Near the entrance, another man shifted uncomfortably as if expecting the old veteran to protest. Walter did neither. His gaze drifted briefly toward the display case. Inside sat a restored M40 rifle mounted beneath bright overhead lights. For just a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not sadness, something older, something distant. Then it was gone. "I understand," Walter said quietly. His voice carried the rough edge of age, but there was no bitterness in it. He reached down, adjusted his grip on the cane, and turned toward the exit. Tyler let out a short laugh under his breath. "That was easier than I thought." A few people looked away. Others watched in silence as Walter made the long walk across the showroom floor. The old man moved slowly but steadily. The bell above the front door jingled softly when he stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. The door closed behind him. The crowd began returning to their shopping. Conversations resumed. Cash registers beeped. The ordinary rhythm of the store returned almost instantly. But near the back of the room, one customer remained perfectly still. He had been standing beside a rack of hunting gear throughout the entire confrontation. His eyes followed Walter through the front window until the old veteran disappeared from view. Then his attention shifted toward something resting on the floor near the display counter. A folded piece of yellowed paper had slipped from Walter's satchel during the confrontation. Nobody else seemed to notice it. The customer slowly bent down and picked it up. The moment he saw the faded Marine Corps insignia stamped across the top, the color drained from his face. The customer who picked up the paper was named Ethan Cole, 26 years old, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the quiet discipline of an active-duty Marine corporal. He had spent most of the confrontation pretending not to watch. Now he stood frozen beside the display rack, staring at the document in his hands. Around him, the normal sounds of the gun shop continued. Customers chatted about hunting season. A register drawer slammed shut. Somewhere near the entrance, Tyler Brooks laughed with another employee as if the entire incident had already been forgotten. Ethan barely heard any of it. The paper felt fragile between his fingers. Decades old. Folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become permanent. At the top sat an official Marine Corps stamp, faded by time, but still unmistakable. Beneath it were rows of typewritten entries and handwritten notes that looked older than Ethan himself. He glanced toward the front door. Walter Hayes was already gone. A strange feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. Something was wrong. Not dangerous. Not immediate. Just wrong. He looked back at the document. Most of the text was difficult to read, but one line near the center remained surprisingly clear. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He read it again. The name itself meant nothing at first, but the designation beside it did. He had seen that designation before. Not in a history book. Not online. Inside a briefing room at Camp Lejeune less than a year earlier. A retired colonel had spent nearly an hour telling stories about legendary Marine Corps support personnel whose contributions never appeared in public records. Ethan remembered because one story had stood out from all the others. It involved a maintenance specialist attached to a sniper element during Vietnam. Someone whose technical expertise had become so respected that entire units reportedly refused to deploy without him nearby. Most Marines assumed the story had been exaggerated over time. A legend, a ghost story passed between generations. Yet the designation on the document matched exactly. Ethan felt a chill despite the warm air inside the store. He flipped the page over. Near the bottom sat a faded signature. Walter Hayes, the same man who had just been escorted out like an inconvenience. Ethan looked up sharply. Tyler was helping a customer near the counter, completely unaware. The manager was reviewing inventory sheets. Nobody else seemed to realize what might have just happened. Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He moved toward the entrance. Outside, bright sunlight reflected from rows of parked vehicles. The afternoon heat shimmered above the asphalt. Walter was nowhere in sight. Ethan scanned the shopping center. Nothing. The old veteran had vanished into the flow of weekend traffic. He exhaled slowly and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered above the screen. Part of him felt ridiculous. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the document belonged to someone else. Maybe it was nothing more than an old piece of memorabilia. Then he remembered Walter's eyes. The calm. The silence. The complete absence of any need to prove himself. Ethan had met enough Marines to recognize confidence. What he had seen inside the gun shop had been something entirely different. It had been certainty. He opened his contacts and selected a number. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer answered on the second ring. "Cole, what is it?" Ethan glanced back through the shop window. Tyler was still smiling. Still joking. Still completely unaware. Ethan lowered his voice. "Staff Sergeant, I think somebody just threw a Marine Corps legend out of a gun store." There was a brief pause. Then a quiet laugh. "What are you talking about?" Ethan looked down at the folded document in his hand. "Honestly, Staff Sergeant," he said, watching the faded Marine Corps seal catch the sunlight, "I am not sure yet. But I think you need to see this." Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer did not laugh a second time. The moment Ethan sent photographs of the document, the tone of the conversation changed completely. Ethan stood beneath the shade of a concrete overhang outside the shopping center while cars rolled through the parking lot and families carried bags between stores. The ordinary afternoon continued around him, unaware that something unusual had just begun. His phone remained pressed against his ear. For nearly 30 seconds, Mercer said nothing at all. Ethan could hear papers moving, a keyboard clicking. Then the staff sergeant finally spoke. His voice had lost every trace of amusement. "Where did you get this?" Ethan looked toward the gun shop. Through the front windows he could still see Tyler helping customers. It fell out of an old man's satchel. Another pause followed. Longer this time. "Describe him." Ethan did. The cane. The weather jacket. The leather satchel. The pale blue eyes. The silence. When he finished, Mercer exhaled slowly. "Stay where you are. You know who he is?" Ethan asked. "I am not saying that yet." "Staff Sergeant." Mercer interrupted him. "Do not leave. Do not lose that document. And if that man comes back, do not let him walk away without getting a phone number." The call ended. Ethan stared at the screen. The uneasy feeling in his stomach deepened. Inside the gun shop, business continued as normal. Tyler Brooks was leaning casually against a display counter telling a story that made several customers laugh. The manager appeared relaxed again. Whatever concern had existed earlier was long gone. Ethan, however, could not shake the growing sense that everyone inside was standing in the middle of a problem they did not yet understand. 20 minutes later, his phone rang again. "Mercer." Ethan answered immediately. This time there was background noise on the line. Multiple voices. Doors opening and closing. The sound of people moving quickly. "Cole," Mercer said. "Who else has seen the document?" "Nobody." "Good." Ethan frowned. What is going on? Another brief silence. Do you remember Colonel Whitaker's lecture last year? Ethan straightened. The one about Marine Corps support legends? Yes. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The sniper support story? Exactly. Ethan looked through the window again. Suddenly, the old rifle display seemed far more significant than it had an hour earlier. You think it is him? Mercer's answer came carefully. I think there is a very real possibility that Walter Hayes is not simply a veteran. A gust of warm wind swept across the parking lot. Ethan watched a shopping cart roll slowly across the asphalt. Then who is he? He asked. Mercer lowered his voice. There are people whose names become famous. Then there are people whose names disappear because entire units decide they deserve privacy. Ethan listened without speaking. I just contacted a retired gunnery sergeant who served under one of the officers connected to that file. Mercer continued. The moment I mentioned the designation, he asked if Hayes was still alive. Ethan felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. What did he say? He said if it is the same Walter Hayes, every Marine sniper from that generation owes him more than they can ever repay. Ethan slowly turned toward the road leading away from the shopping center. Somewhere beyond the traffic and afternoon sunlight, the old veteran was continuing his day, completely unaware of the conversations now unfolding behind him. Mercer spoke again. I am forwarding the images for verification. To who? Ethan asked. This time the answer came immediately. Marine Corps Historical Command. Ethan blinked. The word seemed unreal. Historical Command did not investigate ordinary paperwork. They did not stop what they were doing because an elderly man visited a gun shop. Yet that was exactly what appeared to be happening. Across the parking lot, Tyler Brooks laughed again. The sound carried faintly through the glass storefront. Ethan looked at him and wondered how long that confidence would last. 300 miles away, inside a quiet office lined with photographs and display cases, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale adjusted his reading glasses and stared at the images on his computer screen. Outside his window, the afternoon sun reflected off the manicured grounds of Marine Corps Base Quantico. The office was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. Hale had spent nearly 20 years working with historical records. He had reviewed citations, archived reports, retirement documents, and forgotten personnel files from every era of Marine Corps history. Very little surprised him anymore. Yet the moment the scanned document appeared on his monitor, he stopped what he was doing. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he sat back in his chair. For several seconds he simply stared. A knock sounded at the door. Sir. A civilian analyst stepped inside carrying a folder. You wanted the procurement reports? Hale barely looked up, closed the door. The analyst hesitated before doing exactly that. Hale pointed toward the screen. Take a look. The analyst stepped closer. His expression remained neutral at first. Then his eyebrows lifted. No way. Hale nodded once. That was my reaction. The office fell quiet again. The document itself was not classified. It was not top secret. It contained no operational information. Yet the name attached to it carried a weight that few people outside certain circles would ever understand. The analyst lowered his voice. Do we know if he is still alive? Hale turned toward another monitor and began typing. Database records appeared. Personnel archives. Historical correspondence. Unit support rosters. The search results kept returning the same answer. Walter Hayes. Status, living. Age, 83. Residence confirmed. Hale leaned back slowly. Apparently he is. The analyst looked genuinely stunned. I thought he was a legend. Hale gave a faint smile. That is usually how legends start. They survive long enough for everyone else to assume they are not real. He clicked another file. A faded photograph appeared on screen. 5 Marines stood beside a temporary structure somewhere in Southeast Asia. The image quality was poor. The uniforms were worn. The men looked impossibly young. One figure stood near the edge of the photograph, holding a toolbox instead of a rifle. Walter Hayes. The analyst stared. That is him. Hale nodded. That is him. The office phone rang. Hale answered immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Hale. A voice from headquarters responded. We reviewed the file. Hale listened. His posture straightened. Understood. The analyst watched his expression change. By the time the call ended, Hale was already standing. Sir. Hale looked toward the photograph one final time. The commandant's office wants confirmation. The analyst blinked. The commandant. Hale nodded. Apparently, someone higher up recognized the designation faster than we did. Outside the office, activity began to increase. Emails moved through official channels. Calls were placed. Questions spread from one department to another. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was raising their voice. Yet a quiet urgency settled over every conversation. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Walter Hayes sat alone at a small diner near the edge of town. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the booths and reflected softly from the chrome trim along the counter. A waitress topped off his coffee without asking. She knew him by name. Walter thanked her with a polite nod. His leather satchel rested beside him. The missing document had not yet been discovered. He unfolded a newspaper and continued reading as if nothing unusual had happened that day. Around him, ordinary life moved at its familiar pace. Couples shared meals. Truck drivers discussed weather forecasts. A television mounted above the counter played a baseball game. Walter appeared completely at peace. He did not know that conversations about him were now taking place inside Marine Corps offices across the country. He did not know that senior officials were reviewing records that had not been opened in years. Most of all, he did not know that the simple document left behind on a gun shop floor had just awakened a part of Marine Corps history that many believed had faded into memory decades ago. Walter Hayes finished his coffee just as the evening sun began settling lower across the horizon. Golden light spilled through the diner windows, painting long shadows across the floor. He folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beside his empty cup. The waitress smiled as she passed. "You heading home, Walter?" He returned the smile. "Eventually." She nodded. It was the same answer he always gave. Walter reached down and picked up the old leather satchel resting beside the booth. The leather creaked softly as he lifted it. Years of use had darkened its surface and worn smooth the edges. To most people, it looked like nothing more than an old bag carried by an old man. To Walter, it held memories measured not in years, but in lifetimes. As his hand brushed the side pocket, something felt different. His fingers paused. He opened the flap. The document was gone. For a moment, he simply stared. Not alarmed. Not angry. Just thoughtful. His eyes drifted toward the diner window. Outside, traffic rolled steadily along the highway. The missing paper immediately brought back another afternoon many decades earlier. The scent of coffee faded. The sounds of the diner dissolved. Suddenly, he was 19 years old again. The humid air pressed against his skin. The distant hum of generators mixed with the constant rhythm of helicopters moving across a dusty forward operating area. Rows of equipment lined the edge of the camp. Young Marines moved between temporary structures carrying tools, supplies, and messages. Walter remembered the heat most of all. It seemed to settle over everything like a heavy blanket. Back then, he had not been a sniper. He had not been an officer. He had never commanded troops or stood in front of cameras. His job appeared ordinary on paper. He maintained equipment, repaired rifles, solved problems nobody else noticed until they became emergencies. Yet over time, Marines from different units began seeking him out whenever something important stopped working. Rifles that refused to hold zero. Optics that failed inspections. Equipment that should have been replaced but could not be. Walter found ways to make things work again. Not because regulations required it. Because Marines depended on it. One memory stood out above the others. A young lieutenant standing beside a workbench late one evening. Exhausted. Frustrated. Preparing for an operation scheduled at sunrise. His team had experienced repeated equipment issues throughout the week. Walter had spent nearly 6 hours fixing problems no official report would ever mention. When the work was finally finished, the lieutenant handed him a folded document. "You should keep this," the officer had said. Walter remembered shaking his head immediately. "I do not need paperwork." The lieutenant smiled. "This is not for recognition." Walter looked down at the page. It contained maintenance authorizations, handwritten notes, and signatures from multiple officers. Nothing impressive. Nothing valuable. Yet at the bottom sat a simple statement. Essential to mission readiness. Walter could still remember reading those words beneath the yellow glow of a portable lamp. He had folded the paper and placed it inside his satchel. Not because it proved anything. Because it reminded him that quiet work mattered. The memory faded. The diner returned. The evening sunlight once again filled the room. Walter sat silently for several seconds before closing the satchel. The missing document bothered him less than it probably should have. If someone found it, they would likely throw it away. Most people would see only old paper. Nothing more. Walter placed a few bills on the table and stood. Outside, the sky was turning orange above the distant tree line. As he stepped toward the door, a black government sedan pulled into the parking lot. Then another. Walter barely noticed. He adjusted his grip on the cane and continued walking. Behind him, several people inside the diner turned toward the windows. The vehicles had no markings, no flashing lights. Yet there was something unmistakably official about the way they arrived. And from the lead car, a man in a Marine Corps uniform stepped out carrying a folder that contained a single name written across the front. Walter Hayes. Walter Hayes had reached the far edge of the parking lot when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. They were measured, professional, not hurried, yet carrying a sense of purpose that made him stop and turn. The evening breeze moved gently across the pavement, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby field. The man approaching wore the uniform of a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. His posture was impeccable, his expression serious. Behind him, two other Marines remained near the black sedans, waiting quietly. Walter studied the officer for a moment. Then he smiled faintly. "You seem a little far from Quantico, Colonel." The officer stopped several feet away. For a second, he simply looked at the old man. The photographs had not prepared him for the reality. Walter Hayes appeared smaller than expected. Older, more fragile. Yet there was something in his eyes that immediately matched every account Hale had read throughout the afternoon. Calm, steady, unshaken. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale came to attention without hesitation. The movement was crisp enough that several people watching through the diner windows fell silent. Walter's smile faded into mild confusion. "Colonel." Hale extended the folder in both hands. "Sir, I believe this belongs to you." Walter looked down. The yellow document rested inside the open folder. He stared at it for several seconds before nodding. "I wondered where that went." Hale almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he shook his head slightly. "You have no idea what happened after it went missing." Walter accepted the document carefully and slid it back into his satchel. "I suspect I do not." Hale glanced toward the waiting vehicles. His phone had not stopped ringing for nearly 2 hours. Historical Command. Headquarters Marine Corps. Retired officers. Active duty generals. Every new conversation seemed to uncover another layer of the same story. Yet the man standing before him appeared completely unconcerned. "Sir," Hale said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Walter adjusted his grip on the cane. "You just drove several hundred miles to return a piece of paper. I suppose you have earned the right." Hale looked directly at him. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Walter frowned slightly. "Tell them what?" "Who you were." The old veteran glanced toward the horizon where the last orange light of sunset was beginning to fade. For a moment, he seemed to consider the question. Then he shrugged. The Marines who mattered already knew. Hale felt the answer settle over him like a weight. Simple, honest, impossible to argue with. The parking lot grew quiet. Even the distant traffic seemed muted. Hale thought about the reports he had reviewed that afternoon. The maintenance records, the letters from officers, the testimonials from Marines whose careers had spanned decades. Again and again, the same theme appeared. Walter Hayes never sought recognition, never requested awards, never corrected people who underestimated him. He simply did the work. "Sir," Hale said carefully, "there is something else you should know." Walter raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." This time Hale allowed himself a brief smile. "The gun shop." Walter immediately understood. "What about it?" Hale exhaled slowly. "People are asking questions." Walter looked mildly amused. "Questions? About an old man buying rifle parts?" Hale shook his head. "Not exactly." Before he could explain further, his phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen and felt his expression tighten. Another call from Headquarters Marine Corps. The fourth in less than an hour. Hale answered. He listened. Then he straightened noticeably. "Understood, sir." The call ended. Walter watched him patiently. "More questions?" Hale looked at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and admiration. "No, sir." He paused. "Now they are issuing instructions." Lieutenant Colonel Hale slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the waiting sedans. One of the Marines standing beside the vehicles was already speaking quietly into a radio. Another was checking messages on a government-issued tablet. The atmosphere had changed. What began as a simple document recovery had become something much larger. Walter watched the activity with mild curiosity. Instructions from who? He asked. Hale hesitated for a moment. Headquarters, Marine Corps. Walter sighed softly. That sounds expensive. Hale laughed despite himself. The old veteran's ability to remain completely unaffected by the situation felt almost surreal. Most people would have demanded answers. Walter seemed more concerned about delaying everyone's evening. Across the country, however, phones continued ringing. Inside offices at Quantico, retired officers were receiving unexpected calls. Historical records specialists were reopening files that had not been reviewed in decades. Names once spoken only during reunions and private conversations were suddenly being discussed again. The reason was surprisingly simple. The further officials dug into Walter Hayes's history, the more remarkable the picture became. He had never served in a role designed to attract attention. He had never commanded battalions. He had never appeared in recruiting campaigns or military publications. Yet dozens of highly respected Marines had left written statements describing him in nearly identical terms. Essential, trusted, irreplaceable. One retired general had responded to a phone call with only 6 words. You found Walter Hayes alive. Another had reportedly canceled a dinner engagement to speak with historical command directly. Back at the shopping center, Ethan Cole sat inside his truck watching events unfold from a distance. He had followed the developments through a steady stream of calls and messages. Even now his phone vibrated with new updates. The latest message came from Staff Sergeant Mercer. Ethan read it twice before shaking his head in disbelief. Verification confirmed. Additional records located. Senior leadership notified. Ethan leaned back against the seat. Earlier that afternoon, he had watched an elderly man get dismissed from a gun shop. Now senior Marine Corps leadership was discussing that same man. It felt impossible. Yet every new piece of information pointed in the same direction. Meanwhile, inside the gun shop, Tyler Brooks was closing out a sales transaction when his manager emerged from the office carrying a tablet. The manager's expression looked unusually serious. Tyler. Yeah. You remember that old guy from earlier? Tyler rolled his eyes. The one with the satchel? Yes. Tyler shrugged. What about him? The manager hesitated. Somebody posted a video. Tyler glanced up. So, it has already been shared several thousand times. Tyler frowned. Why would anybody care? The manager turned the screen around. Comments continued appearing every few seconds. Former Marines. Active duty Marines. Veterans from across the country. Many recognized details that Tyler had completely overlooked. Others were discussing names and stories he had never heard before. One comment simply read, "If that is Walter Hayes, somebody made a very big mistake." Tyler felt a small knot form in his stomach. For the first time all day, uncertainty replaced confidence. Outside, darkness continued settling across the town. Streetlights flickered on one by one. In the parking lot near the diner, Walter Hayes stood quietly beside the sedans while Hale listened to yet another phone call. Finally, the lieutenant colonel nodded and ended the conversation. He looked at Walter. Then he looked toward the highway. "Sir," he said carefully, "there is a request." Walter immediately smiled. "I was afraid of that." Hale returned the smile. "They would like you to come with us tomorrow morning." Walter adjusted the satchel on his shoulder. "And who exactly is they?" Hale paused. For the first time all evening, even he seemed impressed by the answer. "Everyone." The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. A cool breeze moved through the trees surrounding the Marine Corps installation as vehicles rolled steadily through the security gates. Flags snapped gently atop their poles. The base was already awake. Marines moved between buildings carrying folders, equipment cases, and cups of coffee. To an outside observer, it looked like any other day. It was not. Walter Hayes stepped out of the black sedan with his leather satchel resting against his side and his cane in one hand. He wore the same faded jacket he had worn the previous afternoon. Nothing about his appearance suggested importance. Yet the moment he reached the walkway, conversations nearby seemed to soften. Heads turned. Not because people recognized him immediately, because they sensed the unusual attention surrounding him. Lieutenant Colonel Hale walked beside him. "I should warn you," Hale said. "This may be larger than either of us expected." Walter smiled faintly. That sentence rarely leads anywhere good. Hale almost laughed. Almost. They continued toward a large administrative building near the center of the base. Along the way, Walter noticed something unusual. Marines kept looking at him. Some offered polite nods. Others seemed to study his face carefully before whispering to one another. The further they walked, the more obvious it became. Word had spread. Inside the building, activity was even more unusual. Staff officers moved quickly through hallways. Doors opened and closed. Phones rang. Yet beneath all of it existed a strange current of anticipation. Hale guided Walter into a conference room overlooking a parade field. The room itself was simple. Long table, leather chairs, large windows. Several officers were already waiting. Some wore uniforms carrying decades of service ribbons. Others represented departments Walter had never interacted with during his own time in the Corps. The moment he entered, every conversation stopped. Silence settled across the room. Walter looked around. I hope none of you canceled anything important. A few smiles appeared. The tension eased slightly. Then one of the officers stood. Brigadier General Thomas Callahan. His hair had turned silver years ago, but his posture remained perfectly straight. He stepped forward slowly. Mr. Hayes. Walter extended a hand. General. Instead of shaking it immediately, Callahan studied him for several seconds. The room remained silent. Finally, the general spoke. Do you know how many times your name appeared in records reviewed overnight? Walter blinked. I am afraid to ask. A few officers chuckled quietly. Callahan did not. More than 100. The room fell silent again. Walter's expression changed only slightly. That seems excessive. Not according to the people who wrote them. Callahan replied. He opened a thick folder resting on the table. Inside were photocopies of letters, evaluations, recommendations, and personal accounts collected over decades. Marine officers described you as the man who kept operations running when nobody else could. He turned another page. Several called you indispensable. Another page. One colonel referred to you as the most trusted Marine he ever served beside. Walter looked away from the folder. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable. Those men were being generous. Callahan slowly closed the folder. No, Mr. Hayes. His voice carried across the room with quiet certainty. They were being honest. Outside the conference room windows, movement began appearing along the parade field. More vehicles were arriving. Uniformed Marines were taking positions. Walter noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. He looked toward Hale, then toward the general. What exactly is happening out there? For the first time that morning, Callahan smiled. The same thing that should have happened years ago. The parade field stretched beneath the bright morning sky like a sea of perfectly aligned uniforms. Walter Hayes stood beside Lieutenant Colonel Hale near the reviewing platform, his weathered satchel resting against his side and his cane planted firmly on the ground. For a long moment, he simply stared. Rows upon rows of Marines filled the field. Some were young enough to be his great-grandchildren. Others carried decades of service in the lines on their faces. Yet every one of them stood motionless, waiting. The breeze carried the distant rustle of flags and the faint cry of gulls from somewhere beyond the base. Walter looked toward General Callahan. You really did not need to do all this. The general's expression softened. Respectfully, sir, we did. Before Walter could respond, another vehicle rolled to a stop near the reviewing area. Several officers stepped aside as a senior Marine emerged. The insignia on his uniform immediately drew attention. Conversations ceased. Even among generals, his arrival carried weight. He approached Walter directly. The old veteran frowned slightly, trying to place the face. The officer smiled. You would not remember me. Walter studied him. Probably not. You repaired a rifle for my father in 1971. Walter blinked. The officer laughed quietly. That is the story he told every Thanksgiving for 40 years. A ripple of amusement moved through the nearby officers. Walter shook his head. I fixed a lot of rifles. Exactly. The officer extended his hand. And apparently you fixed a lot more than rifles. Around them, the ceremony began. Commands echoed across the field. Hundreds of Marines moved with precise discipline. The sight was impressive. Yet Walter seemed almost uncomfortable standing at the center of it. He had spent his entire life avoiding attention. Now there was nowhere to hide. General Callahan stepped forward and addressed the formation. His voice carried clearly across the parade ground. He spoke about service, about quiet professionalism, about the people history often overlooks. Then he began reading excerpts from the letters discovered during the previous 24 hours. Officers describing impossible deadlines met because Walter found solutions. Marines explaining how his knowledge kept critical equipment operating when missions depended on it. Commanders writing that they trusted him without hesitation. The words were simple, honest, unpolished. That was what made them powerful. As each account was read, the silence across the field deepened. Many of the younger Marines had never heard the name Walter Hayes before. By the time the final letter was finished, none of them would forget it. Then came the moment nobody expected. General Callahan closed the folder and turned toward Walter. "Sir," he said quietly, though the microphone carried the words across the entire field. "Yesterday you were asked to leave a store because people failed to recognize your value. Today the Marine Corps would like to correct that mistake." The general stepped back. Every Marine on the field came to attention. Hundreds of heels struck the ground as one. The sound rolled across the base like distant thunder. Then came complete silence. Not a dramatic silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A respectful silence. The kind reserved for things that matter. Walter stood motionless. His pale blue eyes moved slowly across the formation. For the first time since this strange chain of events had begun, emotion touched his expression. Not pride. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something deeper. Gratitude. General Callahan raised his hand in salute. One by one, every Marine on the field followed. The salute spread outward until hundreds stood honoring a man who had never asked for recognition and never expected it. Walter remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he nodded once. It was all he could manage. It was all he needed to say. The wind tugged gently at the flags above the parade field. Somewhere far away, a video from a gun shop continued spreading across the country. People argued about what happened. Others debated the details. None of that mattered anymore, because the truth had already spoken for itself. Some Marines earn recognition through rank. Others earn it through medals. And a rare few earn it through a lifetime of service so quiet that history almost forgets them. Almost. Respect is never demanded. It is earned. And when it is truly earned, it echoes long after the world finally learns the name.